The 9,424th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. Mr. Dirk Polman, journalist, and Mr. Jimmy Dore, political commentator.
But there is actually new evidence which I want to present here. Professor Emeritus Dr. Ola Tunander, formerly Peace Research Institute Oslo, wrote to me on request addressing the location, stressing that the location of the sabotage was at a very deep position of the pipeline, where 80 meters depth. In some distance to each side, the depth would have been 30 to 40 meters. Why was the deep location picked? Remember this info for later, please. Tunander wrote to me, and I quote him now, the explosives were deployed in the Bornholm Basin at a depth of 75 to 80 meters. Such deep dives require a decompression chamber. The story about a small sailing boat is impossible. It cannot bring the necessary decompression chamber. The depth indicates professional or military divers. Norwegian seismological station NORSA states a magnitude of 2.1 to 2.3 of the explosion, which corresponds to 650 to 900 kilogram of TNT. Geophone Potsdam claimed that the magnitude was higher, 3.1, which would correspond to several tons of TNT. This operation would be impossible to run from a small sailing boat. Each section of the pipeline of steel and concrete is 12 meters long and has a weight of 24 tons. About 250 meters of the pipeline Nordstream-String A and B have been blown away. It was a huge blast run by a state agency. When you do a huge professional operation, you firstly need a cover for the deployment of the bombs. And secondly, you need to disconnect the deployment from the triggering of the bombs. Otherwise, people would easily find out who the perpetrators are. The obvious cover was the Baltops 20T exercise in June 22, with 45 ships from various NATO countries. They exercised mine warfare with divers and unmanned underwater vehicles. US ships like the small aircraft carrier USS Kearsarge, 257 meters, and USS Gunston Hall, 190 meters, were both capable of bringing a midget submarine, which could have been useful for the deployment of explosives at such a depth. A remark by me, the two ships can transport, deploy, and load mini-subs back into the hull on high sea. I go on with Professor Tunander. One witness as well as Seymour Hersh have both claimed that US Navy divers with deep diving equipment from Panama City, Florida were present. They had nothing to do with the exercise. They had very likely been used to deploy the bombs. Seymour Hersh claims that they had dropped a sonar buoy from a P-8 Poseidon aircraft. The buoy had sent a coded signal that triggered the timers of the bombs. This is an easy and practical way to do it. Seymour Hersh sources, supposedly from the CIA, also told him that the US had used a Norwegian Poseidon to pull the trigger. Americans like plausible deniability, but there is something we have to add. It might have been the US plan, but such an operation did not fit with traditional Norwegian security policy. So the Norwegians, at a higher level, seem to have backed out, contrary to the information Seymour Hersh got. What happened instead? On 21st of September, a US Poseidon, and everything I quote now is new, flew from Sigonella, Italy, up to the Nordholz Navy airfield in Germany. That is an airfield from the naval aviation in Germany. And flew for 3 nights back and forth over Bornholm, 22nd to 25th September, and then on 26th September, back to Sigonella. It could have easily dropped a sonar buoy over the sea close to Bornholm. If Hersh was right, then the Norwegians were supposed to drop the sonar buoy. The Americans at Sigonella would have to fetch it from Norway. So on 14th September, a US Hercules flew 7 hours up from Sigonella to Andenes, northern Norway, and then back to Sigonella over Keflavik. We have reason to believe that the Hercules fetched something very important in Norway, a specific sonar buoy, and brought it to Sigonella.
Happened. Now, you don't need to be a genius investigative reporter to figure out who is the culprit of the Nord Stream attack. Incredibly, Most Western news outlets ignore the fact that the President of the United States, Joe Biden himself, announced on February 9th, 2022, that he would in fact attack the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, saying, and I quote, "If Russia invades Ukraine, tanks crossing the border again, there will no longer be a Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We will bring an end to it. I promise you, we will be able to do it." Even with that pre-admission of guilt from the President of the United States, most of the Western press remained baffled as to who could have pulled off the greatest act of eco-terrorism in history. But luckily, we don't have to rely on my interpretation of President Biden's clear threat to attack the pipelines. We actually have Seymour Hersh, a genius investigative reporter with impeccable reputation and credentials, who reported that in June of 2022, United States Navy divers operating under the cover of a widely publicized summer NATO exercise known as Baltops 22 planted the remotely triggered explosives that 3 months later destroyed 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines, according to a source with direct knowledge of the operational planning. And like all criminals, the perpetrators could not contain their elation over committing the crime. Shortly after the attack, many high-ranking U.S. officials could not help but brag about their achievements and expressed multiple times how they were proud of being able to put an end to the pipelines. Under-Secretary of State Victoria Nuland said, "I am, and I think the administration is, very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea." The United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken called it a tremendous opportunity to once and for all remove the dependence on Russian energy. You have to be a paid liar to not acknowledge the hand of the United States in carrying out these attacks. Not only did President Biden declare he would do this, but high-ranking U.S. officials have said similar things for years. We can look to 2014 when former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice stated that over the long run, you simply want to change the structure of energy dependence. You want to depend more on North American energy platforms, which is what this is really all about. An economic war between the West and Russia in order to fill the pockets of rapacious capitalists who actually pull the strings of the U.S. government and dictate foreign policy, and remind them of the true cause of not only the Nord Stream bombing, but of the entire Ukraine war and the destabilization of the Middle East, including Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. The reason for that is the imperialistic lust of the United States empire. The U.S. now has over 800 military bases around the world without being able to cite an actual threat to their sovereignty. The U.S. is now ending its empire the way all empires end, by overextending itself militarily while it starves its own people at home. The real threat is the threat of U.S. economic interests. The U.S. has for decades feared German engineering and capital joining Russia's natural resources and manpower. As elucidated very clearly by the founder of the U.S. intelligence firm Stratford, George Friedman, in his 2010 book, says, quote, "Russia does not threaten America's global position, but the mere possibility that it might collaborate with Europe, and particularly Germany, opens up the most significant threat in a decade, a long-term threat that needs to be nipped in the bud. Therefore, maintaining a powerful wedge between Germany and Russia is of overwhelming interest to the United States." For the U.S., Friedman added in 2015, the primordial fear is German technology and German capital, combining with Russian natural resources and Russian manpower to form the only combination that has for centuries scared the hell out of the United States. In this showdown, the U.S. aims to control the line from the Baltics to the Black Sea. Russia, by contrast, must have at least a neutral Ukraine, not a pro-Western Ukraine, because a neutral Ukraine would impede the primordial U.S. goal of a Russian-German fissure, the U.S. has opted for a proxy war instead. The Western governments are silent, even as the U.S. says through anonymous sources that Ukraine is responsible for the Nord Stream attack, but they won't blame them publicly. And so the United States continues to arm Ukraine to the teeth in hopes of extending the war and avoiding peace. The Germans say it's Ukraine, but will not release their official investigation and will not make an announcement. The final obscenity is that the people in the West who claim to be environmentalists and claim to care about climate change and the environment say nothing about the worst release of methane gas in human history, but in fact whose actions reveal they don't actually care about climate change and continue to support this war and its eco-terrorism. In a bizarre twist, even Greta Thunberg traveled to Ukraine to meet with Zelensky after the Nord Stream bombing.
Representative of Russian Federation.
We thank Dirk Pullman and Jimmy Dore for their briefings, which have once again demonstrated to the Security Council that the citizens of Western countries also have a great deal of questions for their governments amid the numerous inconsistencies in the narrative promoted by Washington and its allies in connection with the bombing of the Nord Stream gas pipelines in September 2022. Dear colleagues, exactly a year has passed since the act of sabotage in the Baltic Sea. Nearly as much time has passed since the first Security Council meeting on this topic. Over the past 12 months, we have heard a great deal about how the national investigations carried out by Germany, Denmark, and Sweden are about to find the culprits of this crime any day now. However, there have been no results so far, nor are there any to this day, despite 7 meetings of the Security Council on this topic, both open and closed meetings. At the same time, more and more evidence is emerging in the expert community showing that the Nord Stream explosion is the work of Washington, which stooped to committing this outrageous crime, guided by a narrow, selfish desire to consolidate its dominance in Europe, which is in dire need of Russian energy resources. Today's sad anniversary is an excellent opportunity to briefly recall the timeline of events. Let me remind you of the key points. As early as September 28th, immediately after the sabotage, the Prosecutor General's Office of Russia opened a criminal case under the article relating to acts of international terrorism. Denmark and Sweden had indicated in their letter to the UN Security Council on September 29th that the Nord Streams were destroyed by explosive devices. This seems to have been the only specific conclusion we have heard in all this time. However, the German Prosecutor General's Office began its official investigation only on October 10th. In October 2022, communiques were sent from the chairman of the government of the Russian Federation, Mikhail Mishustin, to Berlin, Copenhagen, and Stockholm on the need to conduct a comprehensive investigation of the events with the participation of representatives of Russian authorities and the Gazprom Corporation. There have been no responses to these letters over the past year. In November, the Russian Prosecutor General's Office sent requests to German, Danish, and Swedish competent authorities to provide legal assistance and form joint investigative teams. In response, we received only boilerplate non-answers.
The representative of Brazil.
The explosions in the Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipelines caused enormous economic losses, contributed to aggravate international tensions, and heightened geopolitical uncertainty in the region. Any attack to a massive energy infrastructure is bound to have a profound impact on how international actors perceive the security of their own critical assets. It is also disconcerting to witness the insufficient attention paid to the environmental impacts of the explosions. It stands in stark contrast to the readiness of many nations to assign blame when incidents occur in other regions of the globe. It is important and urgent to determine the causes of this incident. Brazil has expressed on numerous occasions its confidence in the investigations conducted by national authorities of Denmark, Germany, and Sweden. We do so again today and reiterate our support for the conduct of the procedures without external interference. At the same time, we believe that the seriousness of the episode, a clear threat to international peace and security, requires transparent and timely disclosure of at least preliminary conclusions of those investigations. Lack of reliable information leaves ample room for speculation and accusations, including those related to the war in Ukraine. It only feeds already very high tensions. We certainly do not need to aggravate them. Thank you.
I thank the representative.